She's the kind of cook, and I want this recorded. I want this on the internet forever. She is an amazing cook, okay? She is. I think I'm passable, but she's much better than I am. However, she does frustrate me just a little bit because she's the kind of cook that just kind of looks at whatever she's making and says, oh, yeah, if I throw a little bit of this in and a little bit of this in, I don't really need a recipe. I can figure it out. And that frustrates me because in most areas of our life, we are the exact opposite. I'm very chaotic. She's very by the book. But when it comes to cooking, I always follow a recipe, and she never does. And 90% of the time, that works out terrific. About 10% of the time, it's a little rough. Now, I am responsible for a large amount of that 10% of the time because I'll tell her over and over, you need to follow a recipe, you need to follow a recipe, it's better if you follow a recipe, you should follow a recipe. And she is not used to following recipes, but occasionally she'll give in. And when she gives in and decides, okay, fine, I'll follow a recipe, she sometimes doesn't read it very thoroughly. There's a particular time when we decided we were going to have fish tacos. That was going to be our dinner that night. And I was busy making the fish, and she was making the tortillas, handmade from scratch. They are really, really good when you do them correctly. As I said before, my wife is not very used to following recipes because she never does. So she makes these tortillas, and they look beautiful. I mean, they look absolutely gorgeous. And I'm like, okay, that looks like it's going to be a good dinner. She rips a little piece of one off, and she pops it in her mouth, and she immediately goes, And there's two types of when you cook, okay? The first one is and that's a good The second one is and that is not good. That is no bueno. If you hear that, it means run away. It means you're ordering Taco Bell tonight. It means you don't eat that dish. Now, she looks at me immediately after giving the of disgust and says, this tastes a little funny. Come try it. Which is dumb. Like, I don't understand why people do this, but everyone does. Where someone will look at them and will say, oh, this tastes disgusting. You should eat it. Or they'll say, oh, man, this smells so gross. Sniff it. And then we're like, okay, sure, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And we go ahead and we go do it. I don't understand, but I'm not a very intelligent person, so I was like, all right, sure. And I walked into the kitchen, and I ripped off a piece of one of the tortillas, and I popped it in my mouth, and There's only one other time in my life I've tasted something like that. It was while I was laying in bed shortly after we had gotten married. We were about to go to sleep, and I looked over and I saw this lamp that we have sitting next to our bed. Some of you might have a similar lamp in your house because they're rather popular. They're called Himalayan salt lamps. And Himalayan salt lamps are basically a bulb with a big hunk of salt that has been placed over top of it and glued down to a wooden base. And they make this really pretty, like, pink or orange glow. Like I said before, I'm kind of dumb. And so I looked at it and I thought, I wonder if it's real salt. And I actually said that out loud, and Maggie just stares at me, because when this happens, she just kind of looks at me and she's like, oh, God bless him, he's going to hurt himself. And she's just kind of staring at me, not trying to prevent it at all. And I lean over and I grab the lamp and just, It was salt. That lamp tasted like one of these tortillas. So I looked at Maggie and I said, Maggie, how much salt did you put in that tortilla? She said, 2 tablespoons. I went, you mean 2 teaspoons? She said, no, 2 tablespoons. She was happy about it. I said, can I see the recipe, please? I looked at the recipe and I go down, okay, water, flour, salt, 2 TSP. TSP. That means teaspoon, which is, I don't know, half the size, a fourth of the size of what a tablespoon is. She put like 4 times as much salt in these tortillas as should have been there. If I had hung one of these in the backyard, it would have attracted deer. It was not a good tortilla. Now, we threw these tortillas out, we tried again. The next batch were wonderful. We had a very nice dinner. The fish was a little bit cold, but it worked out. Now, I tell this story for 2 reasons. One, because it is a guilty pleasure of mine to stand on stage and to tell embarrassing stories about my wife. It's okay, though, because she has more friends than me, so she gets me back. It's just more subtle and socially acceptable when she does it. The second reason is because I believe that leading change in a church or a community or a business or even in your own personal life is very much like cooking. You need a recipe, you need a strategy, you need the right ingredients, you need a sufficient period of time, you need a cook or two or three, depending on how complicated that dish is. You need some leaders, you need some people to lead that change. And last of all, you need some heat or some pressure, or maybe a little bit of both. You need some energy. Cooking is in many ways very similar to leading a change in a church or in a community or even in your own personal life. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about a particular change that we want to see, a pretty all-encompassing change that we want to see in our church and ultimately in our community, that we want to be, in the words of our vision statement, a unbroken community. We want to confront drug addiction and broken families. We want to introduce people to Jesus. We want people to be able to live their lives to the fullest and in service to God, and we believe that we are in a unique position to make that happen. But if we're going to make that change occur, if we're going to see our vision fulfilled, then, well, we probably need a recipe. We need a strategy. We need a process. I think that God normally, when he institutes change, goes through a 3-step process. We see it all throughout the Bible, but there's one specific story of a man named Gideon where I think we can see it most clearly. So we'll be going through his story today. And we'll see this 3-step process that God has for instituting change amongst his people in the world and in the communities in which his people live. And the first step, the first ingredient, the first thing that God needs is, well, people. He needs some cooks, if you will. And we see God identifying one in Judges chapter 6. It'll be on the screen, or you can turn with me on your phones or in a paper Bible if you wish. Judges chapter 6, starting in verse 11, we see that God identifies an individual. He finds a person to lead this change. The scripture reads, "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, the son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Mighty hero, the Lord is with you.'" Now, admittedly, reading this with zero context is kind of weird and doesn't make much sense. So let's talk about exactly what was going on in Gideon's life when this happened. Gideon is, as we will find out later, the youngest son of a very unimportant family in a very unimportant clan in a very unimportant tribe in northern Israel. Israel, at this point in time, was not exactly what we would consider to be a modern nation. It didn't quite fit our description of a country. It was more of what might be called a confederacy. It was a group of independent states, tiny little tribes that associated with one another when they had to, but preferred to be left alone. Because of this, they weren't exactly a regional power. In fact, sometimes even during times of war, some of the larger tribes would just look at the smaller tribes and be like, "That's your problem," and just let them be attacked by their neighbors. And that was pretty much what was going on at this point in time. Several of the weaker tribes in northern Israel had been raided repeatedly by a group of people called the Midianites. The Midianites were this nomadic group that would come in and raid an area, steal their crops, take their money away, and then they'd leave, and then a couple months later they would come back. So this has been going on for several years. Northern Israel had been oppressed. They'd been repeatedly attacked, and Gideon had been raised during this period of time. In fact, if you read later parts of his story, it turns out that his brothers fought against the Midianites, and they ended up dying because of it. Gideon was pretty used to this war, and he decided it's probably better to just stay out of the Midianites' way. I don't want to end up like my brothers after all. So when he finally finds a little bit of food, a little bit of wheat, and he needs to process it, to thresh it, that's just a process where you break the inedible part off the center of it, and that little middle part of the grain is what you can actually eat. And he decides, well, I shouldn't do this out in the open, which is what they normally do, so he hides in a wine press. And I'm assuming most of you probably don't know what a wine press looks like. And if you do, then you probably know what a European press looks like. A Middle Eastern wine press, especially an Israeli one, is something like this. It's just a big hole in the ground, sometimes a little channel cut in the side of it. So when we find Gideon, this is the way that we're introduced to him, he's literally hiding in a hole in the ground so he doesn't get bullied by the neighbors. And God approaches him. The angel of the Lord comes to him and says, "Mighty hero." It's a little bit weird. God sees something in Gideon that Gideon clearly does not see in himself, because Gideon is literally hiding in a hole. And God sees a mighty hero. The first step in God's plan to institute change in the world is finding people, someone to lead it, someone to act it out, or sometimes a very large group of people. It's not always the ones that we expect. Gideon was, a little bit of a coward when God first found him, but he saw potential, and God selected him and said, "You know what? I'm going to make some big change through you." And, well, he does. The first step in God's recipe for change is people. And once you have the people, you kind of got to do something with them. And if you want to do something with them, then they have to know what it is you want them to do. So after God did a little bit of, shall we say, character building with Gideon, then, well, it was time to come up with a plan. And that's the second step of God's three-part recipe for creating change. A plan. Sometimes God comes up with a plan and he just hands it off to his people. Sometimes he just looks at some of the leaders of his people and says, "You know what? You guys come up with a plan yourselves. I trust you. You have the intelligence. You have the wherewithal. You can do it." We don't really know which one happened in this case, but we do know that somehow either Gideon or God or someone else came up with kind of weird but pretty ingenious plan, and we know that they started thinking about it pretty well in advance. Why? Because after a couple of weeks or maybe months after Gideon had gathered his army, God looks at him and says, "Hey, I want you to whittle that army down a little bit." Gideon had a couple thousand men. He was very much outnumbered by the Midianites. But God looked at him and said, "You know what? I think you have too many men. I want to prove a point here. I want you to understand that this is done by my power, not by yours. So send some of your men home." And Gideon says, "Hey, God, how many do you want me to send home?" And God looks at Gideon and says, "You know what? I think 300 men should be enough." And Gideon said, "What?" And God said, "Did I stutter?" That's my personal translation. Gideon ends up with 300 men, but we have a pretty interesting verse as he's sending away all of his extra soldiers. I think we read over a lot, but it indicates that Gideon had something going on in his brain, some sort of plan formulating as he sent those soldiers away. We read that in Judges chapter 7. It says, "So Gideon collected the provisions and the ram's horns." That's a really weird note. He collected all their supplies and a bunch of trumpets. That's a little bit weird. Of the other warriors, the ones that he was sending home, and he sent them home. But he kept 300 men with him. Generally, if you see someone collecting something that random, that weird, that out there, it means they have some sort of plan. They're planning on doing something with it. If you work at a grocery store and someone comes through and they're buying 8,000 rubber bands, you think they might be making a rubber band ball. Or they're doing that kind of weird video where you're like, explode watermelon. Or they're playing some really horrific prank on their roommates. It could be any of those, but they probably have a plan. So when Gideon is collecting hundreds upon hundreds of ram's horns, of ancient trumpets, you assume he's probably got a plan for them. And indeed, he does. I'll summarize the next couple of verses for you. Gideon comes to his men and says, "Hey, guys, don't worry about bringing your swords. Don't worry about bringing your axes. Don't worry about bringing your weapons. We don't need them. I have torches, I have jars, and I have trumpets." And they look at Gideon and they say, "You haven't done this before, have you, bud?" He says, No, guys, trust me. So he gives every man a torch, a clay jar, and a ram's horn. And I kind of don't know how they carried everything. Like maybe they lit the torch on fire and then they stuck it under their armpit and then like held a jar over it and then like had the ram's horn in the other hand and like marched into battle like this. I don't really know. But somehow with just two hands they managed to carry these three items. And Gideon said, "Just keep your eyes on me." He split them up into three different groups, said, "Keep your eyes on me. And when I break my jar and I blow on the horn and I yell, then you do the same." And they waited for the middle of the night. They set up around the perimeter of one side of the camp. And they kept their eyes on Gideon. They had a plan. And they got in position. Can you guess what the third step in God's recipe is? If he already has a people, Gideon plus 300, and he already has a plan, well, I think they probably need to act on the plan. Probably needs to be some implementation happening. The third step in God's normal recipe for change is action, which we see just a couple verses later in Judges 7:21 through 22. It says, each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as all the Midianites rushed into a panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew their ram's horns, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled. Gideon has a really weird battle plan here. It doesn't make much sense. If you ran it by the majority of people who have any idea of how to operate a battle, or anyone older than a kindergartner, they could probably tell you this plan is not going to work 99.9% of the time. But Gideon had really counted the costs, as it were. He really looked at this situation and made sure he did everything right, because he said, look, we can't win this in a straight-up battle, so we're going to have to use a little bit of strategy, a little bit of subterfuge. And he set all this up in the middle of the night. Now put yourself in the shoes or in the sandals of a Midianite soldier. You're in a very large camp. And actually, some verses that we skipped over says that Gideon waited until the changing of the guard. Changing of the guard is an interesting time because it's the only time in the middle of the night where you would have armed soldiers walking through camp. Why? Because they just finished guarding and they're now going to their tents. So you have some armed soldiers walking around. There wouldn't be very many fires in the camp except for on the perimeter to help the lookout. So things would have been dark, a little bit confusing, would have been a little bit hard to see people, tell who is who. In addition to that, you have a whole lot of animals. Some of these animals would have been war horses or camels or something along those lines that would have been trained for battle. They would have been used to loud noises, hard to distract. They wouldn't stampede easily. But a lot of these animals would have been pack animals. After all, if you're going to spend a few months raiding northern Israel, then you need a lot of supplies, and you need animals to carry all that plunder back with you. So they would have had a lot of farm animals with them. And farm animals sometimes do not like loud noises very much, especially ones in the ancient world that weren't used to combines and other large machines. So if in the middle of the night, suddenly 300 jars shatter, 300 horns blow, and then you hear a lot of yelling, these animals might have started stampeding. In addition to that, you have soldiers wandering around the camp who are armed, and when you wake up in your bed, you look out the front of your tent and you see armed soldiers and charging animals, and you think, oh no, we're under attack. So you grab whatever's nearby and you get ready to defend yourself. It's dark, it's hard to tell who is friend and who is foe. The camp is thrown into a panic, people die, and others flee, and Gideon wins the day without ever actually attacking. Now, as fun and as weird as this story is, the point of looking at it today is to understand God's three-step process for change. He saw that his people were oppressed, they were being controlled by a foreign power, and he said, I need to free them. He took a little bit of an unusual route to do it, but he used the same three-step process for change that he normally does. He identified a group of people, Gideon first, and then 300 soldiers to join him. They came up with a plan, whether it was God that came up with it or Gideon that came up with it, we don't know, but a plan was made, and then that plan was put into action. And we have done our best here at Berean to follow the exact same three-step process that Gideon did. It started off with a people, which conveniently enough we already have, and you all are a part of. Whether you've been here for 30 years or for a couple of months, you are all a part of the family here at Berean. So we have a people capable of action. And we believe that this people has been specially chosen by God to reach our community. Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. We are not the only Christians reaching this community. We have brothers and sisters all across the town and all around the town that are part of that same mission. We just believe that God is going to use us in a different way than he uses them. And we want to be faithful to that mission. So God has a people here. Next of all, we need a plan. It's been mentioned a couple of times here and there from stage, or you might have heard it while you're talking to other people from the church, but over the last couple of months, we've been devoting ourselves to something we've called our 3-year plan, or you might have called it, or heard it called REACH. And the idea of reach is we basically want to say, where is the church now? Where does the church need to be in 3 years? If God really had his way in Murphysboro, what would our church look like 3 years from now? And we spent the last couple of months praying about that, talking about that, reading about that, and trying to discern what God's will for our church is. We came up with a strategy, with a plan that we will be fully implementing in January. So that means we have one step left. Action. There's no point in making a plan if we're just going to ignore it, right? There's no point in volunteers that have spent hours and hours and hours working on this, spending all that time away from their families, all that time reading, all that time emailing, all that time in meetings, if we're just going to ignore the plan and not do it. So we have to take action, and each and every one of you can be a part of that. There's a number of problems, or maybe it's better to call them opportunities, in Murphysboro that we want to address, that we've been talking about addressing. And for each one of those problems, there is also a solution. Now, Berean wants to address these problems, and we've come up with a number of ways. Now, that shrank since the last time that I saw it, but hopefully we can still get through. There's a problem of isolated people in our community. Now, that's a problem all across the United States. People are just growing more and more isolated. We're working online, we're driving to work, coming home. We're so surrounded by people all throughout the day that we tend to kind of lock our doors and stay in our homes away from others. But people were not designed to live like that. We're social creatures. So how do we address that problem? There's a lack of safe places for students. That's a problem everywhere in the nation. You can never have enough good, safe places for high schoolers, for middle schoolers, for elementary schoolers, for other kids and students to stay when they're not at school or when they're not at home. We have an issue of Christians, people who know God, people who know Jesus, that are far away from him. That's a problem everywhere. We have a perception in the community that churches, not just our church, but all churches are unfriendly, that they're unwelcoming, that they're just country clubs for religious people. We have the issue of distance education, which is a very new issue amidst COVID-19. We have an issue of the growth in internet usage. Now, I don't consider that to be a problem because I love the internet, but it's certainly an opportunity for ministry, isn't it? And last of all, there's a whole lot of work to do in Murphysboro that there's just not enough people to do. So how do we respond to that? Here's some of the ways that Berean has and will continue to try and respond to those things. Our elders have redoubled their efforts as shepherds. Everyone whose number we have has been placed on a shepherding list, and you guys should have been getting calls and texts and emails and check-ins from the elders, making sure you're okay, seeing if there's anything that we can do for you. If you've not been placed on one of those lists, it's just because we don't have your information. You pass that along to us, we'll make sure you get on one. We'll make sure people are checking in on you. 39 and Holding is a great ministry here that takes care of some of the more elderly people in our congregation, although anyone of any age is welcome, helps build relationships, build friendships. And we started our socially distanced services. This one, slightly more socially distanced than some of the other services have been, but we have a lot of people out of town this week. There's a problem of safe place for students, and you guys, long before I got here, have been doing B.H.A.G, been doing youth Bible studies. There are Christians that are far from God. And again, there's so many ministries that you've done before I got here. Weekly sermons, the Connect studies on Wednesdays and Sundays, although that midweek one is on Thursday now. If anyone wants a Bible study, Thursday nights, we got you covered. And now weekly Devos on Wednesday. If you haven't been following those, you get to see my beautiful face twice a week, and that's never a bad thing, right? Now, I don't need to read the rest to you because, well, you can read for yourself. But there's so many different problems, so many different opportunities in our community, and so many different ways that our church has responded. One that I'm the most proud of is right there at the bottom, that starting in January 2021, each and every month, Berean is committing to doing at least one outreach activity, one outreach event, and they're going to look really different. Some weeks it's just going to be going out and handing out water because it's hot, just finding people, hey, are you thirsty? Here's a bottle of water. Sometimes it's going to be going to the school district or to the police department or to the city council and saying, hey, what is one thing around town that volunteers could do that you just don't have the time or money to deal with? And they'll give us a list of things. We'll pick one that we think we're capable of doing, and we'll just go do it for them, just as a way to bless them, just as a way to show the love of Christ to other people. We're going to be doing at least one every month and at least one big one every single quarter. From here until the doors close, we are committing to doing that. That's something that I'm very, very proud of and very excited to do. The thing is, if we're going to do that many ministries, if we're going to do that many things to bless other people, we need help. We need servants. We need volunteers. So that brings us to the surveys that are on your chairs. They're very intentionally worded to just ask you, hey, what are you good at? And if there's something that you're good at, then we can find a place for you to serve. I'm going to give you a few minutes here to go ahead and fill that out. If you're watching online, we send out an email at 9:30. If we have your email, if you receive our weekly newsletter, then you should have gotten that. There's a Google form, and you can fill it out online, and we'll still get your answer. We'd very much appreciate you guys taking the time to fill that out really quick, and then hopefully you'll be hearing from some ministry leaders with opportunities for you to serve. Now, if you're watching online, we thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and let you go now so you guys can cut the stream whenever you're ready. I'll give you all here a few minutes to fill that out, and then I'll go ahead and close.